Hello everybody, welcome to WhatCulture. I'm Scott, joined by Josh.
Hello Scott.
And happy Thor's Day. We've just been to see Thor, Love and Thunder, and we thought we'd do a big old spoiler review, so you have been warned. And we're obviously post-embargo, all the reviews are out online. We've just seen the movie, we've barely talked about it, and we're just going to talk about some specific stuff as we go. So spoilers ahead. Josh, what do you think of The Thing?
Scott Tailford, this is a movie of two parts, absolutely, for me. The first part I really did not like, sadly, overall. I was, watching some of those earlier scenes thinking, I can't believe the person who made Thor Ragnarok made this movie. However, it does pick up in the second half and ultimately salvage itself for me. It's not one of the worst MCU offerings, but it's also not one of the best. Ultimately, I come away from it feeling very disappointed because it's not the sequel that I thought it was going to be, but there are still positive elements in there for me overall.
As is usually the case for me in my daily life, I wish I was as optimistic and positive as Josh Brown because I hated this thing, and I'm not going to spend the entire video rambling on in negative sense. We do have specifics to get to, but I just thought it was just horrifically made. I thought it was badly shot. I thought the pacing was terrible. I thought the tone was all over the place. Christian Bale's Gore the God Butcher, for as much as he's throwing himself into it, I didn't care about his drive. His overall story didn't make any sense. I just thought it was extremely poorly made, and I was saying to Josh after it finished, like, I don't really have an anger for the MCU anymore. It's been stripped out of me with the amount of sort of meh TV shows that they've had recently, and the fact that I really didn't like Doctor Strange either. So for this, it was just deflating. It was just like, oh, this is all we get now. It's just nowhere near as good as it used to be.
This is it, because I know you're way more negative on the MCU than I am at the moment. I'm not, like, hot on it, or anywhere near as hot on it as I was, back in Phase 3. However, I know you've come out of this movie and Doctor Strange in a row and just gone, what is
Using
going
the phrase,
on?
I'm done.
Yeah, I'm done. What's this? Scott literally said as we left this theatre, perhaps in jest, I'm not entirely sure, this is one of the worst things I've ever seen in my life.
Yeah, I stand by that. I think this is one of the worst movies I've ever seen. Like, I think this is just abysmally put together. And the thing is, like, it's not a knock on Taika Waititi. Obviously, dude is incredibly capable, and the best parts of this movie do come where you can see his most positive aspects coming through. However, this feels like multiple movies punched and kicked together to the point where every single scene is just function over form. It's just take a full script and then chop bits off until you get down to the most essential few lines that you can get away with, let's say, to push the story forward, or what little story there is, which was the same problem I had with Doctor Strange. And I think that my overall problem with Marvel, just to get it out the way, is that you read so much about how much they fast-track these movies. The fact that Black Widow already went through its previs stuff, they knew where the explosions were going to be and where the set pieces were going to be, and they wrote a script around it. And I think that overall feel, they just can't escape it. They don't let scenes breathe. They don't let characters breathe. A series of things just happen, and it's like, here you go, here's the stuff. And it's like MCU is just a series of Pavlovian responses that I'm no longer responding to anymore.
You have hit a lot of my criticisms on the head in what you've just mentioned there, because I enjoyed the second half of this movie because that's where things did finally manage to slow down. We started getting some sincerity coming through, and the scenes themselves were a little bit longer. They had space to breathe. You could tell that the actors were bringing some kind of pathos to their characters in those moments in a way that I just didn't get in the first half of this movie, where it was just, okay, so we have Thor after the end of Endgame. He's with the Guardians. How do we reintroduce Jane? How do we get into her storyline? How do we get all of these moving parts where we need them to be to finally start the story that we wanted to tell? And it is Taika Waititi and the other filmmakers getting through that baggage where the movie suffers the most, because it just doesn't feel natural. It feels very just disjointed and overall just quite jarring, considering where we left Thor in his last appearance.
Well, the stuff with Jane as well, like, I was really psyched to see Natalie Portman come back. I, like many other people, freaked out at the first image of her dressed as the Mighty Thor. I think she still does look really good in the costume, but for me, they don't pay off her return at all. It's kind of just there. Like, she looks at Mjolnir and it reforms, and then she's just, I'm back, I'm fully able to do everything.
Here's the thing, okay, you mentioned this is 3 movies slapped into one. Should we establish what those 3 movies are? Yeah, before we jump into the actual specifics.
Okay, so it's kind of like a mini Guardians movie. The first sort of, let's say, I don't know, 10 minutes-ish is the stuff you've seen in the trailers where it's Thor hanging out with the Guardians, and they refer to, just a good old Thor-style adventure where it blends over with the tone of the Guardians of the Galaxy. And maybe there are pieces of what maybe it was going to be the initial Guardians 3 script before all the stuff happened with James Gunn, retrofitted to work in here. The other movie is what assumedly, whatever Taika was initially going to do to the sequel of Ragnarok. And then the other part for me is this big old recap fest where they try and sort of go, okay, remember this stuff from the Dark World, remember this stuff from the initial Thor. There's a lot of just kind of cutaways, montages, whatever, to remind you of how far Thor's come. But for me, that only detracted from where he is right now, because he didn't feel like the dude that we left in Endgame.
Yeah, Thor as a character is really strange in this. Like I said before, you know, his interactions in the earlier scenes, it's almost like, and maybe this was intentional, but it's Thor like acting as a caricature of himself, you know.
Yeah.
Even when he's supposed to be sincere in certain scenes, he's doing comedy Thor, and comedy Thor is fine, but it's kind of like lacks the depth that you get from him later on, and it made some of the earlier scenes that aren't played for comedy, that are played straight, you know, played for emotional heft that you need, to fall quite flat, because the tone is all over the place in a lot of ways. Like I said, I do think it settles down, but yeah, for that first hour, maybe even the first hour, I was thinking, oh, this is going so fast, and we're going through a lot of elements, and none of them are quite hitting. I wanted them to hit, which is a big shame.
Well, speaking of tone as well, I mean, even, you know, we talk about establishing stuff on the Thor side. You also have Christian Bale's Gore the God Butcher, and his initial scene, his reason for hating the gods. The way that scene is shot is just very locked off, medium shot, reverse shot stuff that feels like it was put together across the pandemic, and maybe that's the reality of it. But for me, it just felt quite cheaply made. It felt like everyone was just had a green screen thrown behind them. Everyone's very much in a costume. You don't really believe they're there. And it did a very poor job of establishing the stakes. Which, I mean, this is a spoiler review. So for me, if we talk about Gore for a second, his overall story just didn't make any sense. Like, his whole thing is getting Stormbreaker because he wants to open a portal to grant himself a wish and take out all the gods all at once. But if he just needed Stormbringer, then why didn't he just do that from the beginning? He storms Asgard, he takes a whole bunch of the kids to get Thor to come back to him to get the weapon again.
Right.
Could have just taken it in the first place.
He could have, but also, you know, at that point, Thor kind of had an army. You know, he had a fully powered Jane there, he had a fully powered Valkyrie. He had kind of like the momentum, whereas when you take the kids away, in the movie kind of explains that once Gore gets to the Dark Realm, as it's called, like, he's more powerful, you know what I mean? He's playing on home turf rather than taking the fight to an away game going to Asgard. So that was enough for me, honestly, to justify that plot, even though it is a little bit flimsy. Honestly, I think this might be one of our biggest disagreements, because I thought Gore was really good. I thought Christian Bale was like hamming it up.
He's having a lot of fun.
Good way. He's having a lot of fun, while at the same time, the way Taika Waititi shoots Gore is still menacing. I liked Gore creeping out of the shadows. I like a lot of the camera work that they do when his character appears. And if I was a kid watching this especially, I would be so scared of Gore. And I mentioned me being a kid because I do think that the tone of this movie skews way younger than even Thor Ragnarok, you know, and that was a surprise to me. I didn't expect it to be like this kind of mature character study or anything, but it definitely is going for a younger audience, and you can tell that from the sheer amount of kind of kid characters in this, in the roles that they play.
It's Harry Potter and he's Voldemort. Like, that was the entire vibe I got, especially in the scene where he's trying to torture the kids, or he's trying to sort of freak them out, and he's like summoning like a snake and then taking its head off and whatever. Just the way he acts that whole role and his general visual just gave me Voldemort vibes. And I'm not a Harry Potter fan, nor have I barely seen those movies, but I have seen the clips, and I did watch whatever the second last one was.
Deathly Hallows Part 1, Scott,
yes, where Ralph Fiennes is very much hamming it up as Voldemort. And so I've seen those scenes, and I feel like that was a comparison point. But I do agree, the way he's shot and the makeup and the sort of general, the way he commands a lot, the general framing of that character is well done. But for me, it didn't land whatsoever because the build-up to that character was just so flimsy. And so I think, I massively agree that Christian Bale is giving it his all. And he's like one of the most fun characters to watch. I just think that it jars with the overall tone. If the whole thing was this kind of fun, playful, you know, just one more Thor adventure, but you underpin it with, you know, the sadness of the character within, maybe that could have made it work or something. But to me, Christian Bale ultimately felt like another dark elf. He felt like another dude from Thor 2, whose name is so forgettable that I forgot it. That guy.
In a way, I do agree, because he doesn't get enough screen time in this movie, I don't think. When he's on screen, he's very captivating, but yeah, like you say, as a character, he's still a little bit one note. He has one motivation, and then, like a lot of other MCU villains over the past few, even months, if we take it into account Doctor Strange, it's another villain that's corrupted by something. It's corrupted by an evil kind of power. And to an extent, I think visually what they do with that kind of darkness here is good. But yeah, we don't get to see enough depth to him. But they give us enough for it to work for me. Like, could he be better? Yes. Could he be worse? Absolutely. I don't think he's on the same level of Christopher Eccleston's Dark Elf in Thor: The Dark World.
I guess, he's more memorable just because of how much Christian Bale is giving it his all, but in terms of the serviceability in the script, or the memorability in terms of his agency in that script, for me, he serves the same purpose. Big evil dude needs to be taken care of. We should talk about one specific thing that I kind of want to focus on, that I think is just, if you came out with Doctor Strange, sort of wondering, okay, what was going on with America Chavez? Did I miss something in one of the TV shows? What's going on with the amount of TV shows that I now need to keep up with? I feel like this movie hammers home Marvel almost screaming that we need to stop caring about long-form storytelling, because the general feel that I got, and it could be one of their biggest strengths going forward, is that this just needs to work by itself. And for me, it's only dragged down by the fact that kind of going, here's some stuff from Endgame, here's the Guardians, we're bringing back Natalie Portman as old school Jane, and they're also then trying to recap stuff, which takes up a huge amount of the screen time. And I think that if they focus more on character stories overall, kind of like what the Batman just did this year, that might be the future of the MCU, because I feel like anyone going into this going, okay, what's the next Thanos, what's the next 10-year build, what's the next big thing I need to care about? It's not here. It wasn't in Doctor Strange, and it hasn't been in any of the TV shows either. There's vague, mentions of the multiverse stuff. There's a creature here that looks a bit like Galactus.
A little bit.
The entity that Gore was talking to, I was like, that's maybe going to be Galactus, that's maybe going to be the Fantastic Four thing. But for whatever reason, Marvel are not doing that style of storytelling anymore, and I think that they can't press release it, but I feel like there's a general assumption of more that is just not here.
Yeah, I know what you mean. I think when we immediately got Phase 4, it was kind of new characters, or it was filling in the blanks that we already knew, you know what I mean? It was Shang-Chi, it was Black Widow, and then it was introducing people like the Eternals. I think the assumption might have been that by the time we got back around to the established characters, Thor, Doctor Strange or whatever, it would be setting up properly the future of the MCU. However, like you said, that's not necessarily the case, and that's not necessarily a bad thing either. This is a very episodic story that's being told, and I do think that, yes, it draws on the past story threads. That's why there is so much recapping going on, with reintroducing Jane and what have you, but it's very much a standalone thing. I'm fine with that for the short term. Like, I don't need to rush into the next kind of big phase. I will want that eventually, but it works for me, and I think this works better than Doctor Strange in that sense, because for Doctor Strange, even though I think that's a better movie overall, Doctor Strange, you needed, the WandaVision TV show. You needed more information in your brain to properly understand the machinations of that story, whereas here it's like, okay, everything that you need is in the movie itself, and yes, you will have more emotional connections to the story if you have seen the previous Thor movies or the previous Infinity War movies, Avengers movies. However, it kind of tries to contain itself in a way that the MCU hasn't done in a little while.
I think overall there's a general feeling of, and again, it might absolutely be addled by the pandemic, by the fact they had to alter so many different plans, that I just feel like they're struggling a bit. And obviously they had these movies, they had certain calendar slots that they're going to hit. Just like I said, many things have been changed around in regards to their overall release schedule, but I kind of just wish they would take a step back and have a more authored feel to things. It doesn't feel, especially in this specific movie, it doesn't necessarily feel like a Taika movie. Like, there's bits and pieces that do, but overall it still feels like a bunch of studio executives got hands on with it and went, well, we're going to need to pay this bit off. We're going to have a Guns N' Roses song every 10 minutes or whatever it is. Just we need to make sure that it ticks all those boxes for maximum appeal, let's say, rather than let the authorship side of it come through, or the authorship come through, which was the same problem with the Eternals as well. So yeah, I
think you can see kind of the conflict between Marvel and the director in this movie more than you could in Ragnarok, and that was the biggest disappointment for me, because that came at a time, Ragnarok I'm talking about now, that came at a time where the MCU was kind of flagging in terms of trusting its directors. You kind of had James Gunn, but no one else. They felt very formulaic, and then Ragnarok came around, and suddenly it was colourful. Suddenly it had a personality, it had a different sense of humour, whereas this kind of feels somewhat like a regression, and that's kind of where my big disappointment comes from, in terms of it not being as funny as I wanted it to be. Like, there are still a good few jokes in here, but it's not as rapid fire as Ragnarok was, and the actors don't even necessarily seem like they're having as much fun with the material. However, I do think Taika Waititi solved something of an issue that did plague Ragnarok for me, and that was its approach to drama. Like, I believe the drama here more than I did in Ragnarok, which I felt undermined something as big as the destruction of Asgard, actual Ragnarok and what have you, even like the demise of Odin. Here, when you get into the movie's kind of final stretch and you have like these kind of casualties and you have these emotional scenes, especially surrounding Jane, who we'll jump into soon, it worked for me more. There was a better balance overall, just sometimes that was wonky in the individual scene by scene stitching together of it.
There is an actual scene between Jane Foster and Thor when she does have to admit that she does need to go back to hospital, and that Mjolnir is draining her power, and they do need to kind of make sure that you know as the audience the reality that she is going through a cancer battle. For me personally, as much as I think that scene breathed,
right.
I like I said, it's that thing I said before about scenes that have function over form, and it was just like, you know, if you don't know the history of the Mighty Thor, if you don't read the comics, which I barely do, then it felt like that stuff was just sort of thrown in. It's like, okay, that's like a bullet point list of what needs to be included for that character. Let's get through it as fast as possible. I think that scene towards the end is better than her initial setup, but I still think there's way more they could have done with her overall to then make the save towards the end. That would have landed way better if they cemented the writing around her a lot more methodically across the whole film.
Yeah, totally. I think let's jump into that kind of in totality, because it's quite surprising to me in a way that they haven't really shown off why Jane is here in the trailers, and obviously that's a big mystery, but a part of that is because, you know, she's had this cancer diagnosis, she is dying, she got stage 4 cancer, and then she is using Mjolnir to kind of get some energy as a kind of like last-ditch effort. You know, she's drawn to it, as the movie describes. However, that should be the backbone of the movie, and it kind of is, but it is it's under all this other stuff. It's under kind of this weird arc for Thor, it's under this Guardians of the Galaxy stuff, it's under all of this humor, under gore, and it's like there is a great movie surrounding just Thor and Jane.
Yeah, absolutely.
I think if you can kind of trim the fat, and that's why I do agree with your criticism that it's like 3 stories pushed into one, and if you just chose one, I think they're all great, but each one needs that time to breathe. You need to spend more time with Jane. You need to spend more time with even Jane and Thor than we get here, and understand kind of her ultimate sacrifice towards the end of the movie. And it is there. And again, it's enough. I keep saying it's enough. This movie gave me enough, but it didn't give me as much as I wanted.
It was one of those things, like the stuff that I mentioned at the beginning, where I can tell what each scene is going for, but it's almost like you're hitting exactly what that scene was always going to be when the scene itself starts, which is just that whole thing of just not letting a movie breathe anymore. And I don't know how much that comes from the overarching Marvel, studio production cycle side of it, or whatever different ways they had to manufacture this version of the film that came from all these disparate threads that need to pay off so many previous things and also set up so many things going forward as well. Which we can lead into the fact that the very end of the movie sees Thor essentially like adopt Gor's daughter after she's been brought back to life, and that leads into the post-credit stuff, which we will detail more in a separate video. But what do you think of that as an ending point?
I thought it was fine. I thought it was okay. I wasn't convinced. It rolls into the thing I was talking about earlier, where this movie is so much focused on kid characters, and like it's a noble aim. I don't think it is as compelling as the material could have been.
The thing is, it gave me is it Hunt for the Wilder People as Tychus of the film? It gave me such vibes like that, where I feel like, because Hemsworth is a genuinely gifted comedic actor. Like, yes, he's a big action guy, but he's phenomenal in a comedic role, and he bounced off the lady who's playing the daughter as well. They bounced off each other very, very well, and that whole scene gave me Wilder People vibes, where I was like, I would take a Thor movie about him learning how to become a dad, ostensibly like the God of War 2018 thing, and work out all of his demons and that kind of stuff. I feel like that's a promising note to end on. So yeah.
I mean, I guess it is in fitting with the themes of like the movie that Thor is trying to figure out who he is. But I feel like we've seen so many versions of this character now. We've had Thor the boyfriend. We've had Thor kind of who's lost his way and he's been drinking too much and he's been eating too much. Now we've had Thor who's kind of like with the Guardians of the Galaxy, and we end it with Thor is a dad. And I quite like that in one sense, because it is fitting with his character of jumping between identities, living for so long, outliving all of his friends, and ultimately trying to reinvent himself. But at the same time, it makes it difficult to pin down Thor's kind of like central ethos and why we should necessarily want to follow him in the future, because is this another identity that's going to be discarded, or is this going to be him for the foreseeable future, embodying Uncle Thor as he's described?
That's the thing is, you think about that scene that's in Infinity War where you get to see the reality of how much is weighing on him, and he rolls off the amount of people that have died. I thought that rounded him off quite nicely, that you have this sort of showboaty comedic Thor that is almost a persona he's putting on, where the real him is crumbling, and you get a little bit of that after Jane passes away towards the end, where you see him more emotional again, but it's kind of too little too late. It's the very end of the film, and they haven't really done anything else with that level of him until that point anyway. So again, for me, it was quite flat. Next up, we should talk about some stuff that as soon as the movie finished, you were saying was the pivot point for you, which is the stuff in Omnipotent City in regards to Zeus.
Yeah, I mean, this was the scene where I just thought, things were finally clicking into place. You've got the connection between the core trio of Thor, Jane, and Valkyrie. That suddenly kind of kicked into place. I mean, a Korg is there as well, but they're the central trio because in this scene, Korg kind of dies. Like, he gets blasted away, and then there's a really funny gag where just his face survives.
I thought it'd be a pebble with a little face on it.
That would be fun. Kind of like Everything Everywhere All at Once.
Yeah, give me
like
that.
the
That'd be
googly
great.
eyes. Yeah, but this was the scene where I was like, okay, this feels like the successor to Ragnarok. You know, it has this real kind of opulence in the visual design. We've got these actors who are committed to this material, you know, are finally having fun. And we've got a mad Russell Crowe as Zeus being this showboating god. And that was just a scene that I thought kind of had everything. The gags were good. The story drive was clear and present, and the characters were on form. From that point onwards, I felt a shift in gears, and it worked for me, even though I have no idea what Russell Crowe's doing or what accent he's doing, but I kind of dug it, man. I thought it was alright.
I just feel like I'm going to be ultimately just super negative, because for me, I like the idea of that scene. I like the bit when Thor kind of realizes that the gods are super opulent, aren't really going to care, and they do think they're overly safe from what Gore is doing in terms of trying to wipe them out, and Thor takes out Zeus, and I was like, that's a massive deal. He just killed the guy that is his main inspiration in terms of, like he says in the movie, you know, love and thunder and all that kind of stuff that he does. Thunder and lightning is the term that I wanted. But still, he takes out Zeus, and Zeus assumedly dies until the post-credit stuff. And I thought they were going to do more with that. I thought Thor was going to realize that he can't mess around, that he can't think he's overly safe, and that was the whole reason the first half of the film was so disparate, and he needs to focus going forward. And he kind of does that, but it's not reflected in the filmmaking, it's not reflected in the way the whole thing is shot, or Thor's acting itself as a character. So for me, I like the idea of that, but even as they start making their getaway, I kind of thought someone else in that room would care that Zeus just got assassinated, and we just leave that scene immediately.
Well, I suppose, and not to spoil the post-credit video that we're doing, but it later turns out that Zeus isn't dead, and they do that a few times, where they kind of walk back those deaths, like even Jane's, again, going into the post-credit stuff later on, like they kind of show that, yes, people are dead, but it's not kind of like a tragic loss. Like, Korg is still a face, Zeus is getting, you know, bandaged back up, I suppose, and even Jane gets to live on in Valhalla. You know, there is a kind of a nice wrapping of the bow, but also that might lower the stakes in a certain extent. I thought for me that scene ultimately worked, and it kickstarted the film's more visually spectacular half, because I thought once we moved from that to the Dark Realm, which is all in black and white, apart from these splashes of colour, when you have like the powers going off, I thought, right, okay, this movie now has a visual identity, and it's not just, you know, the classic Marvel shot reverse shot slate with some murky CGI going on in the background. There was a real visual identity after that fact that was missing from the first half.
No, I massively agree. I like the idea of shooting a whole fight scene in black and white, and the only thing that shows up are the colours of the powers themselves, whether those are blue lightning bolts or using Zeus's weapon or whatever. That stuff did sort of lead to a memorable finale, not unlike Doctor Strange, where they're fighting with the music notes.
Very true.
And it was one of the coolest visuals in the whole movie. Overall, though, over to you down in the comments below. The embargo, like I said at the beginning, is already up in regards to reviews, so everyone on the internet's going to be talking about this thing, and I don't know what the general consensus is, but I'm Mr. Negative, as always. For now, I've been Scott from WhatCulture.com.
I've been Josh from WhatCulture.com.
And we'll catch you next time.
Bye.
Goodbye.